the autumn of 1873, on the damp and wind-scoured edge of the East Riding of Yorkshire, where the wolds roll into mist-laden fields and the air carries the salt of a distant sea, stood the Whitbyfield Workhouse, a long low edifice of soot-stained brick and slate, its windows narrow as slit eyes, its gates rusted shut against both escape and intrusion. It was not the grandest of such institutions, nor the cruelest by official measure. Yet among those who labored within its confines or passed near it on the car-trotted road to Market Wetton, Whitbyfield acquired a reputation not for severity, but for silence. Not the silence of obedience of which the poor law guardians were proud, but a deeper, more unnerving quiet, the absence of children's voices. For though the census records of 1871 list 42 pauper children resident in the establishment, parish testimonies from the same year note only the clatter of spoons, the shuffle of boots on wet flagstones, and on certain evenings the faintest hum of tune without words drifting from the west dormitory like breath escaping a sealed room. It was within these austere walls that Eleanor Voss was born, though born may be too generous a word for a delivery conducted on a straw pallet in the infirmary. Calder's corner, attended by a weary matron whose own wages had not been paid in months. The father was unknown. The mother, a laundress named Mary Voss, expired before dawn, her last act having been to press a single dried sprig of meadowsweet into the infant's swaddling. No birth certificate was issued, though the workhouse ledger, its ink now faint and blotted, does record, in the hand of overseer Josiah Hargreaves, female foundling, marked No. 78, placed with wet nurse in south wing. Eleanor, as she would come to be called by the older girls who occasionally tended her, grew with the quietude of one who has never known comfort, yet whose eyes hold the gravity of memory. She did not cry as other infants did. She watched. By her 4th year, she could thread a needle, scrub linens until her knuckles bled, and stand for hours in the scullery's chill, her small frame motionless, as though listening to something beyond the steam and clatter. Visitors to the workhouse, inspectors, clergymen, even the occasional philanthropist, would often remark upon her composure, mistaking it for docility. A model of obedience, wrote Dr. Alistair Pembroke in his 1877 report to the Central Poor Law Board. A child of remarkable stillness, almost unnaturally so. Yet others, less inclined to official optimism, noted how the other children avoided her, not out of fear exactly, but as one might avoid a room where the air feels heavier or the light falls wrong. The routines of Whitbyfield were regimented with the precision of a penal colony: rising at 5, work until dusk, gruel twice daily, scripture at intervals, and sleep in unheated dormitories lined with iron-framed cots. Eleanor performed her duties without complaint, but with a precision that unsettled even the most hardened overseers. She never dropped a plate, never spilled soup, never lagged behind, and she cooked. From the age of 8 she was assigned to the kitchen under cook Martha Blythe, a woman whose temper was as caustic as her lye soap, yet who, after 3 weeks of Eleanor's assistance, was heard to mutter, "She knows things no child should." Not that Eleanor spoke of herbs or broths or the subtle balance of flavors. She spoke little at Albert. She would select certain roots from the garden, pare them with a blade so fine it left no waste, and stir the great cauldrons with a rhythm that seemed less mechanical than ritualistic. Witnesses later recalled the scent that issued from the kitchen on those days, not the usual miasma of boiled cabbage and tallow, but something richer, spiced with cinnamon and clove, almost festive, a smell out of place in a house of poverty, yet one that made even the sternest guardian pause on the threshold and inhale as if recalling a forgotten Christmas. It was in this kitchen, on the morning of October 12, 1884, that the first tremor in Whitbyfield's enforced calm occurred. That day, 15 officials, poor law, guardians, clerks, and to visiting magistrates from York had assembled for the quarterly inspection, a rare occasion when the workhouse laid out a modest luncheon in the overseer's parlor: a thin beef stew, boiled potatoes, and a loaf of coarse brown bread, all prepared under Eleanor's silent supervision. The meal passed without incident. The officials praised the unexpected quality of the fare, and overseer Hargreaves, ever eager for commendation, noted in his private journal that the girl Voss has a knack. Yet by dusk, 3 of the visitors had taken ill, nausea, trembling, a disorientation so profound one magistrate mistook his own coachman for a ghost. By midnight, 2 were dead. Within 72 hours, 13 more had succumbed in their homes across Yorkshire and Lincolnshire, their symptoms identical: a sudden weakening of the limbs, a bluing of the lips, and in the final moments, a whispered phrase repeated across households, though none could agree on its origin: "She feeds us still." Only 2 survived, both women, who later refused all inquiries, locking their doors and drawing their curtains against even the midday sun. In the immediate aftermath, panic flared briefly, accusations flew. The local constabulary ransacked the kitchen. Vials were seized, but no poison was found. The workhouse physician, Dr. Linley, performed autopsies and declared the cause gastric fever, exacerbated by stress of travel, a conclusion the board accepted with palpable relief. Eleanor was questioned once, briefly, by a young constable whose notes survive only in fragments. "Child denies malice, says she only followed the old way." Asked what old way, did not answer. She was not punished. There was no evidence. Instead, she was transferred quietly, without record, to the Northallerton Asylum for the Feeble-Minded, a place where inconvenient truths were wrapped in linen and buried beneath layers of protocol. The workhouse itself fell into decline. By 1889, it was converted into a grain store, then abandoned. Yet long after its doors were boarded, locals spoke of lights in the upper windows on fog-bound nights, and of a sense imminent and something bitter rising from the earth where the kitchen garden once grew. The initial inquiry into the deaths of the 15 officials, though officially closed within weeks, left behind a residue of unease that clung to the region like river mist. In the archives of the York County Lunacy Commission, tucked between reports on overcrowding and dietary deficiencies, lies a single yellowed folio stamped confidential withdrawn from public docket. It bears no docket number, only a date November 3, 1884 and the name Eleanor Voss in a clerk's careful script. The contents were never entered into evidence, nor cited in any coroner's report. Yet their survival suggests that someone, at some point, deemed the matter too peculiar to discard entirely. The folio contains 3 items: a charred fragment of what appears to be a recipe card, singed at the edges as though rescued from a hearth, a lock of hair, bound with black thread and labeled from subject, October 14th, and a series of witness depositions, mostly redacted, save for recurring phrases. She never looked at her food. The stew sang. They ate as if in a dream. One deposition, signed by a scullery maid named Agnes Peake, that stands out for its peculiar coherence. Miss Voss would hum while she stirred, not a tune you'd know more like the wind through dry reeds. And when the gentleman came, she ladled each portion with the same hand, the same spoon, and never once wiped it clean between bowls. Yet the broth stayed clear. No grease, no cloud, like water from a well, but warm. Curiously, no trace of poison was ever chemically confirmed. Arsenic, the usual suspect in such domestic mysteries, was absent from the stomach contents of the deceased, as was strychnine and aconite, those silent assassins of the apothecary's shelf. Dr. Linley, whose competence was never formally questioned, noted only an unusual alkalinity in the remains, but attributed it to the consumption of improperly leached tannin-rich bark, a common error among the rural poor. Yet privately, in letters to his brother, a chemist at Cambridge, he confessed bewilderment. The viscera showed no cellular rupture, no inflammation beyond mild gastric distress, yet the nervous collapse was absolute, as though the will to live had simply unspooled. This phrase, unspooled, appears again years later in an unrelated context, in the notes of a retired schoolmaster who claimed to have tutored Eleanor briefly in 1881. He recalled her copying lines from Milton's Paradise Lost, but always omitting the word soul, replacing it with thread. When questioned, she reportedly said, "Souls tangle, threads can be followed back." The silence that followed the incident was not merely administrative, it was social, almost superstitious. Families of the deceased ceased correspondence with one another. Memorial services were held in private chapels with doors barred to neighbors. The 2 surviving officials, Mrs. Eleanor Thorne of Malton and Miss Beatrice Croft of Beverley, withdrew from public life entirely. Mrs. Thorne sold her estate and moved to the Channel Islands, where she was said to eat only food she had prepared herself, using utensils kept locked in a mahogany case. Miss Croft, once an active member of the Yorkshire Ladies' Temperance Society, was found dead in 1891, seated at her dining table, a plate of untouched porridge before her, her hands clasped as if in prayer, yet her eyes were open, fixed on the spoon beside her bowl, which bore faint scratches in a spiral pattern. The local coroner ruled it death by melancholy, a diagnosis fashionable at the time for deaths without clear cause. Meanwhile, at Northallerton Asylum, Eleanor Voss left no official record. The admission ledger lists only female pauper, suspected moral imbecility, with a transfer date of October 20, 1884. But the asylum's kitchen logs tell a different story. On 3 occasions in late 1884 and early 1885, the head cook noted that the new girl from Whitbyfield had been assigned to peel roots and prepare broth for the infirmary ward. Each time, within 24 hours, several patients experienced vivid hallucinations, visions of feasting tables, of voices singing in unison, of loved ones long dead seated across from them, smiling, but no harm came to them. Indeed, some reported a strange sense of peace, even joy, before lapsing back into their usual torpor. The asylum chaplain, Reverend Elliot Marsh, wrote in his private journal, "There is a quality to her presence that does not belong to madness, nor to sanity, but to something older, something that remembers how hunger feels, not just in the belly, but in the bones." He petitioned to have her reassigned from kitchen duties, not out of fear, but out of reverence. His request was denied. Then, in March 1885, Eleanor vanished, not in the dramatic fashion of escape, no broken locks, no footprints in the snow, but as though she had never been there at all. Her cot was found neatly made, her few possessions 2 shifts, a wooden comb, a slate pencil arranged on the pillow. The only anomaly was the infirmary broth pot, left simmering on the stove long after the fire should have died. The liquid inside had reduced to a thick amber syrup, sweet-smelling and strangely luminous in the lamplight. The cook, fearing contamination, poured it down the drain, but for weeks afterward, staff reported hearing the faintest bubbling sound from the pipes beneath the kitchen floor, even when the stoves were cold. No search was mounted. The asylum matron merely struck Eleanor's name from the roster with a single stroke of her pen, as one might erase a smudge. Yet in the margins of that same ledger, in a hand not her own, someone later wrote, in faint pencil, "She feeds the silent." This phrase would resurface decades later, not in medical texts or police files, but in the margins of a privately printed volume of Yorkshire folk remedies, held now in the Bodleian Library. The book, titled Herb Wisdom of the Northern Moors, 1898, contains no index entry for Eleanor Voss, yet sandwiched between instructions for poultices of yarrow and infusions of mugwort is a single unnumbered page, bound in by hand. It describes a method of sustenance extraction, whereby the nourishment of a meal may be drawn not from grain or flesh, but from memory itself, specifically, from the remembrance of being fed with intent. The process, it claims, requires a vessel that has never held malice, a fire that burns without smoke, and a giver who has known true hunger. The resulting broth, the text warns, will satisfy all who partake it. Only those who have caused hunger shall find it fatal. The page bears no author, but the watermark matches that of paper manufactured in Whitby between 1880 and 1886. In the years that followed, the affair of the Whitbyfield luncheon faded into the dim corridors of local folklore, spoken of in hushed tones at parish meetings, alluded to in sermons on divine justice, and occasionally invoked by mothers to frighten children into finishing their porridge. Yet for those who had been close to the event, its gravity did not dissipate. It deepened, like a bruise beneath the skin. The pattern of the deaths, once seen as random, began to reveal a subtle architecture when examined not through the lens of pathology, but of responsibility. Each of the 15 men had, at some point in their official capacity, signed documents that reduced rations at Whitbyfield, delayed repairs to its leaking roofs, or denied petitions for firewood in winter. One had personally vetoed a proposal to allow children to attend Sunday school. Another had ordered the flogging of a boy who stole a crust of bread. None of these acts were legal. Indeed, they were sanctioned by the very principles of deterrent relief upon which the poor law was founded, but together, they formed a ledger of small cruelties, meticulously balanced, it seemed, by a force that understood accountability not as punishment, but as reciprocity. The notion that something deliberate and yet unprovable had occurred began to gnaw at certain corners of the professional class. It was not spoken aloud, but it surfaced in the margins of official correspondence, in the hesitation of a magistrate's signature, in the sudden generosity of a guardian who had once prided himself on fiscal rigor. More telling were the private alterations in behavior. The man who could no longer eat stew without feeling a constriction in his throat. The clerk who insisted his servants wash each spoon twice before setting the table. These were not symptoms of guilt, exactly, but of a dawning awareness that the world might contain mechanisms of justice beyond courts and statutes, mechanisms that operated through taste, through breath, through the quiet intimacy of a shared meal. Then, in 1892, a curious coincidence occurred. A minor outbreak of nervous prostration, as it was then termed, struck the staff of the Wakefield Poor Law Union. No deaths resulted, but 3 clerks collapsed simultaneously during a routine audit, each describing identical visions: a long table lit by candlelight, at which sat shadowy figures eating from empty bowls, while a child in a grey workhouse shift ladled from a pot that never emptied. The only physical evidence was a pot of beef tea, prepared by a new kitchen maid recently transferred from a closed institution near Northallerton, found cooling on the pantry shelf. Analysis revealed nothing harmful, yet the pot itself bore a faint spiral scratch on its inner rim, identical to the one found on Miss Croft's spoon years before. The maid vanished within the week, and the incident was dismissed as mass hysteria, but not before it had reignited dormant anxieties among those who remembered 1884. It was around this time that the first investigator of genuine intellectual rigor turned his attention to the matter. Dr. Alaric Fenwick, a lecturer in moral philosophy at Trinity College, Cambridge, had long been fascinated by the intersection of social policy and psychological consequence. Initially skeptical, he began compiling a dossier after a chance encounter with Reverend Marsh, now retired and living in Scarborough, over tea in a seaside cottage scented with dried lavender. The old chaplain spoke of Eleanor not as a criminal or a lunatic, but as a witness, one who had absorbed the silence of the workhouse so completely that she became its voice. Fenwick, trained in empirical reasoning, dismissed the mystical overtones, yet could not ignore the consistency of the testimonies, the precision of the victim selection, or the absence of conventional motive. He began a quiet, methodical excavation of records, workhouse ledgers, asylum transfer forms, burial certificates, even the minutes of poor law board meetings. What he found was not a conspiracy, but a system, a machine so indifferent to human suffering that it had, in some uncanny way, where it produced its own reckoning. Fenwick's research took him to Whitbyfield in the spring of 1894. The building stood derelict, its windows boarded, its courtyard overgrown with nettles and wild hemlock. Yet the kitchen, though stripped of furnishings, retained an eerie integrity, the great hearth still intact, the flagstones worn smooth in a path from door to stove. Local villagers, wary at first, gradually shared fragments of memory. An old gardener recalled that the soil where the kitchen garden had been would not bear crops. Seeds planted there either failed to sprout or grew twisted, blackened stalks that withered by midsummer. A retired constable mentioned that on certain nights, when the wind blew from the northeast, you could hear the faint clink of a spoon against a bowl. Not loud, mind, but regular, like someone counting. Most striking was the testimony of a woman who, as a girl, had delivered laundry to the workhouse. She remembered Eleanor always saving the smallest crust of bread, not for herself, but for the mice that nested behind the ovens. She'd leave it on a saucer, the woman said, and whisper something to it. Not a prayer, more like a promise. Fenwick spent 3 weeks in the ruins, taking measurements, sketching floor plans, even attempting to recreate the stew from contemporary recipes. Nothing extraordinary occurred, yet he recorded in his journal a growing sense of being watched, not with malice but with patient expectation. On his final evening, as he packed his notes by lamplight, he noticed something previously overlooked, a narrow crack in the kitchen wall, behind where the pantry shelves had stood. Prying it open with his penknife, he found a shallow cavity lined with beeswax, within which rested a small cloth-wrapped bundle. Inside was a child's slate, its surface covered not in writing, but in hundreds of tiny, meticulously scratched spirals, each one identical, each leading inward toward a central point. On the reverse, faint but legible in chalk, were the words, "What is given must be returned." Fenwick took the slate back to Cambridge. He never published his findings. Dr. Alaric Fenwick's silence did not stem from disbelief, but from a dawning conviction that some truths, once known, could not be safely conveyed in the language of reason. His private notebooks, now housed in the Wren Library, though uncatalogued and accessible only by special petition, reveal a man, increasingly estranged from the intellectual certainties of his age. He ceased attending faculty meetings, withdrew his name from a forthcoming treatise on utilitarian ethics, and began spending long hours in the university's botanical gardens, observing how certain plants grew toward light while others, like the yew, thrived in shadow without apparent need for the sun. In his journal, dated October 17, 1895, he wrote, "We have mistaken hunger for greed, silence for ignorance, and obedience for consent. What if the workhouse child was not mad, but attentive? What if she heard what we have trained ourselves not to hear, the sound of a soul being measured in ounces of gruel?" His obsession deepened into a quiet pilgrimage. Over the next 2 years, Fenwick visited every location connected to Eleanor Voss: the Whitbyfield ruins, the North Allerton Asylum, now repurposed as a sanatorium for consumptives, the homes of the deceased officials, even the modest churchyard in Market Wetton where Mary Voss, Eleanor's mother, lay in an unmarked pauper's grave. There, he found something unexpected, not a headstone, but a single meadowsweet plant growing through the cracked earth, its white blooms strangely fragrant, even in November. The sexton, an elderly man with cataracts clouding his eyes, recalled that the grave had been tended intermittently over the years by a quiet woman in grey who left no name but always brought a small loaf of bread, which she would break and scatter for the birds. Never ate any herself, the sexton added, just watched them feed. Fenwick pressed him for dates. The visits, he learned, always coincided with the anniversary of the Whitbyfield luncheon, October 12. It was during this period that Fenwick began collecting oral accounts, not as evidence, but as echoes. He interviewed retired overseers, former pauper children, even the grown son of Dr. Linley, who recalled his father burning a bundle of personal papers the night before his death in 1891, muttering, "Some hungers are not of the body." One of Fenwick's most revealing discoveries came not from a person, but from a place, the cellar of a disused vicarage near Beverley, where a cache of poor law correspondence had been stored in damp crates. Among the invoices and inspection reports, he found a single letter, sealed but unposted, addressed to the Central Board in London. It was penned by Overseer Hargreaves in early November 1884, just days before he too succumbed to a sudden and unexplained decline. The letter was never sent, perhaps because Hargreaves died before posting it, perhaps because he lost the courage. In it, he confessed that the luncheon had not been Eleanor's idea. She was instructed, he wrote, by Cook Blythe, who said the gentleman deserved better than slop. But the girl, she changed the recipe. Not the ingredients, those were as usual, but the order, the stirring, the words under her breath. I heard her. Not words, exactly. It sounds like the ones my own mother used when boiling nettles for spring tonic. And when the stew was served, I saw their faces, not pleasure, but recognition, as if they remembered something they'd long forgotten. And then they ate, and did not stop until their plates were clean. Hargreaves closed with a plea: do not punish the child. Punish the system that made her learn to feed in silence. Fenwick transcribed the letter meticulously. then copied it by hand onto 3 separate sheets of paper, which he mailed to 3 different institutions: the British Library, the Royal Society of Medicine, and the Department of Social Reform at Oxford. None acknowledged receipt. The original letter vanished from his study within a week, though his rooms showed no sign of forced entry. After that, his entries grow more elliptical, more inward. He began experimenting with broth-boiling bones for days, straining the liquid through linen, adding herbs not for flavor but for memory, rosemary for remembrance, sage for clarity, meadowsweet for what he called the sweetness of withheld comfort. He invited colleagues to taste his creations, recording their reactions with scientific detachment. Yet beneath the data, a personal dread simmers. On June 3, 1897, he notes, Mr. Harwood took only 1 spoonful before excusing himself. He wept afterward, though he could not say why. Later he confessed he once denied a widow's petition for coal, said he dreams of her hands, blue at the fingertips. By autumn, Fenwick's health began to fail. He lost weight, not from illness but from a refusal to eat meals prepared by others. He took only broth his own, and even then, sparingly. His handwriting, once precise, grew tremulous. His philosophical inquiries gave way to meditations on reciprocity, on debt, on the ancient laws of guest and host. In one of his final entries, dated February 11, 1898, he wrote, "We believe sustenance flows one way from earth to hand, from hand to mouth. But what if it flows both ways? What if to be fed is to enter a covenant, and to deny food is to break it? And what if the broken covenant seeks balance not through vengeance, but through invitation?" That same week he disappeared. His rooms were found undisturbed, his notebooks neatly stacked, his stove cold. Only his personal broth pot was missing. The university declared him deceased in absentia in 1901. Yet in the spring of 1903, a package arrived at the Bodleian Library, postmarked from Scarborough. Inside was Fenwick's final notebook, wrapped in grey wool, and a single dried sprig of meadowsweet. The last page bore only 2 lines. She did not poison them. She offered them what they had denied others, and they accepted. The notebook's arrival at the Bodleian passed without notice. It was filed among the uncatalogued donations of minor academics and forgotten clerics, its significance obscured by layers of bureaucratic inertia. Yet its contents, though never published, that seemed to ripple outward in subtler ways through whispers in university common rooms, through the sudden interest of a few anthropologists in ritual reciprocity among the English poor, through the quiet inclusion of meadowsweet in the bouquets of certain Yorkshire funerals. The truth, if it could be called that, was not a revelation but an accumulation, a convergence of documents, memories, and absences that, when aligned, formed the outline of something ancient operating within the machinery of modernity. Eleanor Voss had not acted alone, nor even in full consciousness. She had been a vessel, shaped by silence and hunger into a conduit for a logic older than Lan, ethic of balance written not in statutes, but in bone broth and shared breath. This logic revealed itself not in grand gestures, but in patterns too delicate for official record. In the decades following Fenwick's disappearance, scattered reports emerged from across the north, of workhouse kitchens where new cooks refused to serve stew on October 12, of civil servants who, upon reviewing pauper petitions, would suddenly set aside extra provisions for the children, of an elderly woman in Scarborough, seen each autumn placing a small loaf on a stone bench by the sea, then sitting quietly until dusk, as if waiting for someone to join her. No one ever did. Yet the bread was always gone by morning. The local baker, when asked, would only say, "She pays in advance," always has. The most compelling evidence lay not in actions, but in omissions. After 1884, no poor law official in Yorkshire ever again signed a ration reduction without adding a personal note with regret. Under necessity, God forgive, as though aware that paper could carry more than ink, that intent might linger in the fibers of a document like scent in linen. More telling still was the fate of the Whitbyfield workhouse itself. Though structurally sound, it was never reoccupied. Plans to convert it into a school, a factory, even a barracks, were all abandoned after workers reported unbearable fatigue, sudden weeping, or the sensation of being gently but firmly turned away from certain doorways. By 1910, the building stood roofless, its walls half swallowed by ivy. Yet the kitchen hearth remained strangely intact, its stones warm to the touch even in winter. Farmers passing by at dawn sometimes claimed to see smoke thin and sweet-smelling curling from the chimney, though no fire had burned there in 30 years. The final piece of the mystery emerged not from paper, but from sound. In 1923, a retired schoolteacher named Miss Elisa Croom, while sorting through her late father's effects, a former clerk in the York Poor Law Union, discovered a wax cylinder tucked inside a tobacco tin. Her father had dabbled in early phonography, recording sermons and folk songs for his own amusement. This cylinder bore no label, but when played on a restored Edison phonograph, it yielded 37 seconds of audio, the crackle of a fire, the soft scrape of a spoon against earthenware, and beneath it all, a child's voice humming a tuneless, rising and falling phrase, repetitive, hypnotic, achingly simple. Experts at the British Museum later analyzed the recording and confirmed it was made sometime between 1880 and 1885. The acoustic signature matched no known instrument. The melody bore no relation to any English folk tradition, yet when played in the ruins of Whitbyfield's kitchen in 1926, as part of an informal experiment by a curious folklorist, the local rooks fell silent, the wind stilled, and for precisely 37 seconds, the temperature in the room dropped by 7 degrees. The cylinder was lost during the Blitz, but those who heard it remembered the feeling it left behind, not fear, but sorrow, and the uncanny sense of having been offered something they did not deserve. There was no ritual, no dark covenant inked in blood. Only this: in a world that measured worth in labor and obedience, a child who had known only scarcity learned that food carries memory, and memory carries judgment. She did not kill the officials. She fed them what they had denied others: the dignity of being seen, the grace of being nourished and accepting it. They were unmade by their own hunger, not for meat or bread, but for absolution. The horror was not in the act, but in the realization that justice might not roar, but simmer, that it might not strike from above, but rise from below, from the hands of the forgotten, ladling truth into the bowls of the powerful until they could no longer pretend they had not tasted it. And so the story endures, not as scandal, not as crime, but as atmosphere. On still evenings in the East Riding, when the mist gathers in the hollows between the wolds, old residents say you can hear it if you listen closely. Not a scream, not a curse, but the soft, rhythmic tap of a spoon against a bowl, steady as a heartbeat, patient as the earth. It does not beckon, it waits,